Last thing we talked about was the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson basically full power to do whatever he wanted concerning the conflict in Vietnam. Ernest Gruing of Alaska and Wayne Morris of Oregon both were the only members of the Congress that voted against that. The rest went, I think it was 414-0 in the House and 88-2 in the Senate. Probably the worst piece of legislation ever passed in this country's history. So at least those two guys had a clue. And as I mentioned and would reiterate, in talking personally with Senator Mansfield when he was alive many years ago, one of his biggest regrets as senator was voting for that legislation. Okay? Well, today we're going to talk about the differences between American and South Vietnamese strategy in the Vietnam War and that of the North Vietnamese. Keeping in mind now that the Americans and the South Vietnamese are on the same side, right? We're on the same side. Have any troops been committed yet, Dave? No. Okay, all advisors. First started by Eisenhower, then increased by Kennedy, and now it'll be Johnson's decision to decide what he wants to do. Well, when we first started the Vietnam War, the strategy for the American and South Vietnamese wasn't ground troops because we didn't have any on the ground. So the strategy was air attacks, the bombing of North Vietnam from B-52 bombing aircraft. So the strategy early in the war, because we had no troops on the ground, was an airstrike strategy. And to give you an idea, now you've got to remember that North Vietnam is not a very big country, and this thing starts in 64-ish, okay? By the end of 1968, the United States had dropped more bombs on that little country of North Vietnam than they had dropped in all of World War II. They bombed these people continuously. That was the strategy. Drop as many bombs into North Vietnam as you can. And again, in a 4-year period of time, the United States dropped more bombs on the small country of North Vietnam than they dropped in the entire Second World War. Why would you do that? Morgan, give me one reason why they would just bomb the hell out of North Vietnam. What would be one reason you do that?
Discourage them.
From what? You're right there. Discourage them from what? Well, what are they trying to do that's causing us concern? You're getting there. They would discourage them from trying to bring communism into South Vietnam. That's obviously a reason why we bombed. So discourage their efforts to bring communism to South Vietnam. That's what our concern is. And what else is it going to do logistically if you continue to bomb them, Josh? What's it going to do to their country? Destroy it. Damage the country of North Vietnam was one goal. And if you damage the country of North Vietnam enough, the people will get tired of it and they will quit their efforts to try to bring communism to South Vietnam. That seems like a quick and simple solution if you could get them to do it, right? The problem was we bombed them forever and they never did succumb to that, and they never did change their views on bringing communism to South Vietnam. Another thing that was used in North Vietnam was a substance called napalm. Napalm. It's on your ID sheet. Anybody know what napalm is made of? Gasoline and what? Yeah, very good. Chemicals and gasoline, which makes it a jelly gasoline. He's exactly right. It was a jelly-like substance that when you lit it, it would stick to practically anything and burn up to 10 minutes. So if napalm was sent into North Vietnam, it was sticky, like you said, jellyish, and it would stick to things or people and burn for 10 minutes. And usually the effects of napalm on the human body were unbearable pain and almost always resulted in death. Okay? Now, I'm going to get ahead of myself, but there's a famous picture up here you may have seen of a young girl naked running through the streets, and we'll talk about that later after something had been dropped on their city. And we'll talk about that. Keep that in mind. That'll be later in the war, but napalm will come into being. Okay? Another chemical that was used in the Vietnam War was Agent Orange. Agent Orange. Does anybody know what that was? It was a chemical, toxic chemical, but what did it kill? Not people. Foliage. Yep, foliage. It was a toxic chemical herbicide which was intended to deprive North Vietnamese farmers and guerrilla fighters of clean food and water, because it was sent into North Vietnam to destroy crops and foliage. It was also used, the war was fought, it was a weird war because there was a lot of jungle, a lot of foliage, and it also was used to kill foliage that hid the enemy, okay? But it was mainly used to kill food supplies and ruin the water so that the North Vietnamese could not survive. So Agent Orange was a toxic chemical herbicide which was intended to deprive North Vietnamese farmers and guerrilla fighters of clean food and water. It was also used in Vietnam to kill the jungle foliage and reveal communist hiding places. Anybody ever heard of what Agent Orange effects it had on GIs, American GIs? Anybody ever heard that? What would it do? It poisoned you. It was a toxic chemical that was put on your body. It didn't kill you quickly like napalm, but it would certainly cause you some health issues when you got back home if you were exposed to it. That was basically the South Vietnamese and American strategy early in the war because there was no troops there. Okay? Let's talk about the North Vietnamese strategy during the war. A lot different than that of the United States and South Vietnam. Now, what is a guerrilla? And I don't mean a gorilla, I mean a guerrilla in warfare. What's a guerrilla? G-U-E-R-R-I-L-L-A-S. What is a guerrilla or guerrillas? They don't play by the rules. They use guerrilla tactics or tactics that are not supposed to be used. If you're playing a volleyball game, you generally don't kick the girl underneath the net and shin to keep her from blocking it. That'd be against the rules, okay? They didn't care about rules, the North Vietnamese, and they were called guerrillas. Now, these North Vietnamese guerrillas, they were soldiers, but they used guerrilla tactics, were known as the Viet Cong, Vietnamese communists. Viet Cong, mostly referred to in the Vietnam War as the VC. Anybody ever watch Good Morning Vietnam? You guys have seen, how many have seen that? Well, I can't believe it. But anyway, remember he made the big joke about the VC and the PC and the VT and all that? Well, the VC is the nickname for the Viet Cong, or these Vietnamese soldiers from the north that were guerrillas. They used guerrilla tactics. Now, when you use guerrilla tactics, what else is it called? We had it at 9/11. Those were guerrilla tactics, only at a big scale. We called it terrorism, okay? So basically they did things that were unusual in the world of fighting. So whenever you use guerrilla tactics, you're not following the rules, and it can border terrorism if it's at a big enough scale. Now, these guerrilla tactics they used always included hit and run warfare. Now, I don't know if I ever told you the story because I get old and I can't remember. Did I ever tell you about the Taco John story when I was in college, the hit and run story? Well, this is a good example. So, when I was a little older than you, I had been out on the town a little longer than I should have, and I was a little bit hungry, so my buddy and I, Ron Kane, decided to go to Taco John's to eat. And we walked in there, and there was a guy, I don't know if there's a kid in here as small as this kid. But anyway, he was a very small young man, very skinny, and he was behind the counter, okay? And he was trying to be polite, and there was a guy about as big as me there that was drunk and about as rude as he could be. And this kid tried and tried and tried to get through this problem, as you can imagine. Give me my food, you blankety blank. And finally, the kid just gets pissed. And he throws off his white apron. I'll never forget this, and he says, "You and I, we're going out back." And this guy's like as big as I am, and this kid is tiny, okay? Anyway, I said to my buddy, we're not going to get involved in this, but we're not letting this kid get the crap kicked out of him, because it was not going to be good. So we go in the back, and we get back in the back alley. I'm not making this up, and this kid starts jumping around with this business. And I'm going, what are you doing? Anyway, so this kid keeps doing this, and this big guy's kind of looking at him. He kind of comes at him, and the kid slaps him, and he goes, and the guy's face goes, and then he slides over here, and the guy comes at him, and after about 5 minutes of this, the big guy's laying down out, and the little guy dusts himself off, and he goes in and serves us our tacos. Well, what kind of a strategy? Did he get engaged with that guy in a wrestling match? No. What did he use? Hit and run strategy. Hit him and got back. Came in and hit him and got back. That's what the North Vietnamese did. They would come in and hit the Americans. You know, they would assault the Americans, and they wouldn't stand fast. They would slide back in the jungle and hide. And as soon as they were marching again, they'd come out and ambush them and hide back. The biggest fear an American GI had in Vietnam wasn't a confrontation, stand up and slug them out fight, is if they were going to get sniped on an ambush. If they were going to come out and all of a sudden wipe out the whole platoon. And if you watch a show like Good Morning Vietnam, which was, for Forrest Gump is a better example. How many have seen Forrest Gump? Most of you. You remember when they kept walking the trail and the guy would get ahead and he was always making sure that it was clear? They always did that. They would come out and hit and run, and it really didn't follow the rules. They never stood up ever in the Vietnam War, ever, and punched toe-to-toe, ever. Okay? So they used hit-and-run warfare. Now, when you talk about terrorism, and these aren't pretty, so don't think we're painting a pretty picture, I'm going to give you 5 different examples of terrorism that the Viet Cong used in the Vietnam War against American soldiers and South Vietnamese soldiers. Not uncommon. What's a marketplace? Anybody know what a marketplace is? They had one down here. They have one down here every Saturday when the weather gets good. And who's the guy that brings all of his good stuff down there? He has a big garden. What's that? Mrs. Fry's significant other. I don't remember his name, but they have a marketplace down there. People come down, they buy corn and vegetables, and then people sell pies and tacos. That's kind of a marketplace. Well, they had those in South Vietnam. And what these terrorists would do, these VC, could you tell a VC from a South Vietnamese person? I mean, no. So how would you know, right? Well, they would plant bombs in these country marketplaces. And when they would all show up and bring their goods in and everybody would gather, what would happen? The bomb would go off, killing all the people, including South Vietnamese soldiers and American GIs. Very common. So when you watch Good Morning Vietnam, remember they couldn't tell his friend whether he was North or South. And it turned out to be a problem for Adrian Cronauer, right at the end. Where else would American GIs go on their off time? Well, maybe.
That's what I was going to guess.
Brothels, maybe, but where would you go if you didn't want to do that?
Bar.
You go to a bar or nightclub, wouldn't you? And they had them over there in South Vietnam. So what did these VC do? Planted bombs in both nightclubs and bars. Good Morning Vietnam, Siobhan, remember? And that guy pulled Adrian Cronauer because he knew it was going to happen. All of a sudden the bar blew up and killed a bunch of American GIs. Very common. Probably the example that maybe makes most sense to you now is they would put bombs in the middle of the busiest cities in South Vietnam. And they would have casualties, hoping, they didn't care if they killed South Vietnamese civilians and citizens, as long as they got a few South Vietnamese soldiers and American soldiers especially. So they planted bombs lots of places in cities. This is where it gets even sick. So you're an American GI, you got a wife and kid at home. You're sitting, on a bench there in Saigon. Little kid who's not very supervised, 3 years old, comes walking by you. What are you going to do? If you're missing your family. What? Well, you might, but what might you do?
Well, you might.
You might pick them up, might buy them a tree.
They put them on babies?
They would put bombs on babies.
Oh, that's
And when American GIs would pick up those babies, because they were lonesome maybe at home, I'm not kidding you, it was horrid. I haven't even gotten the worst one yet. Now this is a little gross, but it happened and you need to know it. If you were an American GI and you were captured by the VC, you might want to be killed rather than captured, because they didn't follow the rules. And often, either after they killed you or before, they would mail a certain body part of yours after they cut it off back to your family. So you never wanted to have any identification on you, because your family had a chance of having part of your body mailed back to them. They were awful. They were awful. That is the truth. They would send body parts, and I'll leave it at that, of American soldiers back home after they were captured or killed. These people had no conscience, the North Vietnamese. They did not appreciate the Americans involved. They did not want the Americans over there, and they made it pretty well known what they were going to do. So that gives you some ideas in the difference of strategy. We have no troops there yet. We're going to get to that in a minute because our next subtopic is the American commitment in the Vietnam War. We're going to start talking about troops, but prior to that, this is what we were up against. Okay? So that does take us to our next subtopic, which is the American commitment in the Vietnam War. Now, what's going to be a little more problem, and I'll preface it by saying this. My life as a teacher has changed a little bit from the first year I taught to now because of, what? The S word. Social media. Okay? You've got to remember that the Vietnam War is going to be the first televised war in American history, right? Okay? This is going to be televised. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Now when it's televised, what happens? More people know about it. Tell you a story that does relate. I used to coach. I was pretty good. I was very demanding. I could never coach today because I wouldn't last past the parent meeting when I was giving my expectations. But if I chewed a kid's butt out on a Friday night in a basketball game, it was at least until Monday until the superintendent got called. And I got called in his office to say, gee, did you really tell Johnny this at the game Friday night? Well, yeah, I did. I at least had till Monday, right? Now, if you chew a kid's butt out at halftime, the parent knows by the start of the third quarter, right? Because somebody's texted the parent. It's just changed things. So, wars before, a lot of Americans were kind of in the dark and couldn't have opinions about if we were winning or losing because they had no idea. When you televise a war and reports come back nightly, it's a different story, and we'll talk about that. So the war in Vietnam is going to be more of a public war because it becomes the first television war in history. Now, I want you to write this quote down, it's important when we talk about American commitment. Late in October of 1964, President Johnson stated this publicly. I want to make sure you get it down, because it's key to if he keeps his word or not. So we're talking about the Vietnam War. It's late in October 1964. Johnson's been in office. How long? Approximately a year, a little less than a year. And Vietnam's getting to be an issue. And he makes this quote. He said, quote, "We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." This is what he says in October of 1964, 11 months after he takes office. Quote, "We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." One more time. Late October 1964, President Johnson states publicly, "We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." So, Maddie, if you heard him say that on television in October 64, what would you think? He's not going to send troops. He said it publicly, that he wasn't going to do it. So let's go and see how it comes about. And these numbers are important. In January of 1965, we have no troops still in Vietnam, but we have 17,000 American advisors. And those are soldiers, right, for the most part, but they're not combat troops. So in January of 1965, there are approximately 17,000 American advisors in Vietnam. So how many has Johnson sent in? Not very many, right? Okay? It's what he inherited. Well, in February of 1965, these VC guerrillas attack a U.S. military unit, and 7 Americans are killed and 100 more are wounded. In February of 1965, a VC or Viet Cong guerrilla unit attacks a United States military unit in South Vietnam. 7 Americans are killed and about 100 are wounded. Maddie, what does Johnson do in retaliation? Sends troops. First combat troops are sent by President Johnson. What branch are they? From the halls of Marines. He sends United States Marines to South Vietnam immediately afterwards. So the first combat troops arrive in Vietnam in February of 1965. So he's already kind of reneged on his statement, although you might agree with that, to the fact that we had some casualties, so we're going to send some troops in to protect ourselves, right? By April 1st of 1965, that number rose to 28,000 combat troops in South Vietnam. That's how many we had April 1st of 1965. 28,000 combat troops on the ground. By the end of 1965, by the end of that year, 2,500, I'm giving you approximate numbers here on this, approximately 2,500 American GIs had been killed, and there were now 190,000 combat troops in Vietnam. So it went from a few to 28,000 to, by the end of the year, how many? 190, with how many GIs killed? To 2,500. 1 year later, by the end of 1966, you know how many combat troops were in Vietnam? 400,000. 400,000. And what were the casualties? And casualties would be what? Kendra, what would casualties mean? You were either killed or injured, okay? 33